So, last talk. Oh no, how did that happen? That's so bad. But we have Tim here, and I'm sure it's going to be a great talk, very interesting talk about performance. So, let's enjoy this last one.
Thank you. Does everybody hear me okay in the back there? Good? Yeah, so that was really kind of the organizers to put me right after Vitaly. I really appreciate that. That's an easy act to follow. So, but honestly, though, congratulations to the entire group that organized this. This is fantastic. It takes a lot of time and effort to put together a conference, and they do this in their free time, which is ridiculous. So thank you for that. It was fantastic, guys. How many of you are lucky enough to call Zurich your home? I am so jealous of you guys. Oh my gosh, it's beautiful. It's clean. What's that? It rains too much? You know what? I think I would put up with that, with the mountains and the beautiful lake and the cleanness. And I mean, and, you know, the people were really friendly too. I mean, I was struck by that right away in my first train ride. A guy sat next to me and he reached across and he grabbed my forearm and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "You have beautiful skin." I get really good feeling around you. And I was like, man, I get good feeling around you guys too. This is awesome. So, in a little less creepy way. So I want to start by telling stories. In the winter of 1996, my family and I were in the middle of the Nicolet National Forest, which is a very thick forest near where we grew up. And we were in search of our Christmas tree. You see, in the United States, I don't know exactly how it is over here, but in the United States, a lot of families will either pull out the artificial tree that they have in the attic or the basement and set that up, you know, the plastic one. Or they'll run out to the nearest tree lot and grab whatever the best looking tree is, and that's what they bring home, and it's done, right? It's an afternoon, if that. My parents took this very seriously, though. So every year we piled up into our van, and we drove down this long, windy, snowy road. And if we managed not to get stuck, we frequently did. I remember snowmobilers having to help us out many times. We'd eventually find ourselves in this remote part of the forest. Now, this was a part of the forest that we had chosen for two primary reasons. First, after a few years of doing this, we discovered that there were a lot of really good Christmas tree candidates here, right? Kind of important. But second, because no sane people would go there in the middle of winter, which meant that we weren't going to be interrupted. We had this whole territory all to ourselves. We weren't going to run into other people. And we thought this was appealing. So in 1996, we're out there and we're traipsing through this snow. We're looking for the tree. And we march for hours because, again, we take this seriously. And we pass up potential candidates left and right. You know, this one's too thin, that one's too fat. This one has some branches that are a little uneven, not the right color of green. Until finally we find it. It's the perfect tree, beautifully shaped, beautifully colored, and frankly our standards had lessened a little bit over the last several hours because we were getting cold and hungry. So my dad takes out the handsaw and he cuts it down and we tie the rope to it and we start to drag it back towards the van. And we're walking and it's getting darker and it's getting colder. And I start to think, boy, you know, it feels like we've been out here for a very, very long time. I wonder why we haven't reached the van yet. And I look up at my dad. My dad's the designated leader here. My dad is blessed with an internal compass that is, you drop him in the middle of the forest, he finds his way out every time, which is the exact opposite of me. Had I not had an adult chaperone the entire time I was in Zurich, I probably wouldn't be here today. I'd be in some other country. But my dad never had that problem. And I look up at him, and he's got this slightly panicked look in his eyes. And I'm like, oh crap, we're lost. We are lost in the middle of winter, in the middle of a thick forest, in a part of the forest that we chose because nobody else is going to show up, which means we're going to have to figure this out ourselves. Now, you could understand how this made us all a little bit frustrated, right? My dad, in addition to the panic, no doubt had a little bit of some guilt over this because this was kind of his thing. You know, my mom wasn't excited about her 5 children potentially spending the night in the middle of the woods in the middle of winter. And we kids were not excited because we were tired and we were cold and we wanted to get back to the van because we knew what happened when you got the tree back. Hot chocolate with big fluffy marshmallows happened. We always celebrated with these piping hot chocolate, fantastic, and family bonding activities like throwing snowballs and giving your brothers and sisters face washes, which if you're unfamiliar, that's a face wash. And it's a lot of fun if you're that guy over there. But we weren't going to get to do that if we couldn't get back to the van. Now, I can't speak for my siblings. I imagine they were a little scared at the prospect of this, right? I mean, it's kind of scary. But in my skinny little 13-year-old head, I wasn't worried about it at all. You see, I was a Boy Scout. And I figured I was kind of this rugged outdoorsman, right? I mean, I grew up on films of Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, and I figured that somewhere right in between those two was me with my stylish and functional fanny pack. Did you guys have that here? It's okay to admit it. I mean, obviously, I'm showing you guys a picture. Was that a thing in Switzerland?
Only skaters.
Only skaters, all right. Well, that was hot when I was a kid. At least I thought so. See, years and years of training in my backyard had prepared me for this precise moment. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to put together a shelter. It was going to look kind of like this, some sticks up against a log. We'd be able to crawl in there, and that would protect us a little bit from the wind. I'd boil some water. I wasn't sure how I was going to make the fire, but I figured that couldn't be that difficult. And I was going to put in pine needles because I remembered reading somewhere that pine needles were an excellent source of vitamin C, which I figured meant that you could have like a vitamin C pine needle soup thing, right? And it would be cold and it would be a long night, but we'd get out of it thanks to my finely tuned survival skills. Now, luckily for everybody involved, we never had to test those skills because just when it was getting to the point where you could see maybe about a foot in front of you, we stumbled onto the road. And from there, my dad's compass kicked back in and we were able to get back to the van. Now, we didn't really celebrate that year. We just drank our hot chocolate in silence on the way home because we were just happy to be someplace warm and someplace safe. Looking back at what I affectionately refer to as the Christmas tree trip from hell, it's pretty obvious what our problem was, right? We weren't deliberate or intentional about getting back to the van at all. We took that part completely for granted. We just assumed that was going to happen. We focused so much on finding the tree and what happened after we had the tree and we were, successful and everything was completed, but we never really put the two pieces together. The web is suffering from a very similar lack of intent, a very similar lack of deliberateness. Websites are getting fatter and fatter and fatter, and they're doing so at a very alarming rate. It's a very exciting time to be working on the web, right? We have these incredible connections, these incredible souped-up machines, but the problem is that they mask a lot of the performance issues that we end up inflicting on our users. And so what we end up doing is we pile all this stuff on, and we build the web equivalent of this. And it looks awesome, right? I mean, if you guys like a lot of meat, this is a real thing, by the way, in the US, because that's the way we roll. You can go to Arby's and pay $12 and get yourself a meat mountain. But this isn't healthy, right? This isn't healthy at all. According to the latest run of HTTP Archive, which catalogs this sort of information, the average website weighs about 1.7 megabytes. That's a 43% jump from the year before. Now, I use this stat in a few different presentations, and every time I give the presentation with that stat, I have to bump that percentage point higher and higher and higher. I think it started off at like 29. This is a huge jump. This is a big deal. We're adding a lot of weight to our sites. And I think that we recognize that this isn't a great thing, right? Because we talk a lot about how to fix it. And we always come at it from a very technical approach. We have these rules, these set of optimizations, these techniques that we can apply to improve the performance of our sites. But for all of this discussion, we're not actually making any progress. And that's because the problem with web performance today, it isn't a technical issue. It's a cultural issue. Those techniques, those optimizations, they matter, they're important, and I'm happy to talk about them all day. And in fact, if you guys weren't here for Vitaly's presentation, you should definitely watch that after, because he had a ton of great techniques in there. Those things are super important, but the issue is much more deeply rooted than that. At its core, a lack of performance reflects a lack of planning. If we're not deliberate, if we're not intentional about making sure that what we build is lightweight and quick, it's not going to happen. And I think this problem with our process is pretty evident when we actually look at it. I was talking to a friend who had built a responsive site for a large US retailer, and it was a fantastic site, very well built, lots of smart things going on. You could tell it was a good team behind the site. But it was a little heavy, not obnoxiously, just enough that he felt like he needed to explain the situation to me. And he said, you know what, I doubt anyone wants to build a slow site, right? It's just a product of not being afforded the luxury of time and top-down pressure. Now, at first glance, this can sound a little bit like a cop-out, right? But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, it's not, because I think we've all been there. We've all been in situations like this. I know I have. I worked on a project, a responsive build, a redesign, and it was a fantastic team of designers, developers, very smart, very passionate group of people. And we were really excited about this. We were going to go out there and we were going to build this site, and it was going to be beautiful, and it was going to be robust, and it was going to be fast. And we just used that word, fast. So did management. Everybody was saying this thing was going to be fast, right? There was no reason to think it wasn't going to happen. It didn't take long for things to start going south, though. You see, at the outset of the project, we started off in the typical waterfall approach, where the designer would create the comp, the PSD, and pass it over to the wall to the developers, and the developers would go off and build it. Problem was, one of those early tosses, middle management got a peek at it. And they loved what they saw. They loved this comp, and they fell in love with the visual direction here. And so they started dreaming up all sorts of advertising and marketing initiatives based around this. And by the time development saw it, they were already hook, line, and sinker for this thing. So you had design and middle management already sold. There was no way to push back, and we tried, because it was obvious that there were going to be some problems. I mean, there were full-screen carousels here and sliders over there and all sorts of different things. And it was visually compelling, but frankly, it was going to be a horrible beast to try and execute on the web. But we didn't have anything into concrete to stand up on. So, all right, we're a talented team. We'll figure this out. It'll be a challenge, but we'll make do. But then the next strike came in. Because of those marketing and advertising initiatives that they dreamed up, they suddenly needed a shortened timeline, but we didn't truncate the project scope to match. So now we had to build this incredibly complex design in about 3/4 of the time that we had originally, right, with nothing changing in terms of scope. And we found ourselves frantically working all the way through, busting trying to get this done. The impact that this had on the way we talked about that project, the transformation, it was incredible. We went from talking about building something beautiful, robust, and fast to building something that was beautiful and done on time. That was it. That was our entire objective at this point. And so you'd get in a position where you had this feature to build, right? And you could build it one way and take some time and make sure it was robust, make sure it performed well, and get it done the right way. But you were probably going to miss that next deadline. Or you could do it very quickly and kind of cut a few corners and come back and maybe optimize that stuff later, and then you'd make the deadline and everybody would be happy, right? So what do you think we did? We cut the corners. Now, if you've talked to anybody about performance, you've undoubtedly heard that pre-optimization is the root of all evil. Now, there's a lot of truth in this, right? If you're not aware of what the impact is of what you're going to optimize, you can sink a lot of time into something that doesn't matter. But I'm going to argue that when it comes to the actual project as a whole, post-optimization is the root of all evil, because it doesn't happen. We say we're going to come back and we're going to make things faster later, but then later never comes. There's always another feature. There's always another bug. There's always something else that comes up. If we didn't prioritize performance at the beginning of the project, what makes us think we're going to have time to prioritize it after the fact? And so that's what happened. We cut a bunch of corners, and we had originally set out to create this awesome experience. And when we looked at it a few weeks before we were supposed to launch, we realized that we had fallen a little bit short. It ended up something a little more like that. And there was no one thing that we could point at and be like, this is the reason why this is, not going to work for us. It was death by 1,000 cuts. All of these little corners that we cut added up and created this site that in the end was so bloated. Now, again, we took a lot of pride in what we do, so we weren't going to exactly just settle for this. We didn't want to ship this. So for the next few weeks, we busted. I mean, we worked on the weekends. We worked in the late evenings. There were some of us that were there as late as, to 3 a.m. in the morning up through, midnight the next night. I mean, just busting on this stuff. It was crazy. Nobody was taking time off. People were crying. People were yelling. I wasn't crying. People were crying. People were yelling. I mean, it was a very frustrating time for everybody. We made it through, though, thanks to massive amounts of coffee during the day and massive quantities of something entirely different at night. And when it went to launch, it was better, but it wasn't fast. It was still slow. Those issues were just too deeply rooted for us to fix in that time. So we'd improved things, but it still wasn't something we were proud of. So we launched this. It goes out. Everybody's like, yeah, this is visually awesome. And then, The user feedback started to come in shortly after launch. People started, once they stopped looking past the shiny and they're like, wait a minute, why is this taking so long? It takes me forever to get to this page. What's going on? And suddenly all of these performance issues that we knew were there, but that so many of us had swept under the rug, were starting to expose themselves. And everybody was paying attention because suddenly it was broken. And it's a lot like plumbing that way, right? Performance is fundamentally important. It's crucial for what we do, but nobody wants to talk about it until it's too late and it's broken and the toilet's spraying water in your face. You know, the end result of this is we ended up having to go back and do it. Like shortly after launch, we redesigned the whole thing again because we just couldn't keep that up and we couldn't fix the problems. It was painful, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? We can be better than this. Now, there's a whole bunch of different things we could have done. Because we have the ability to make something faster. We have the ability to make robust, fast, optimized sites and applications, things that will delight our users. Now, one of the first things we should have done is make friends early and get the support of everybody on the project and get everybody thinking about performance. I can tell you the wrong way to do this. I worked at an agency, one of the first agencies, when I was first getting into performance, and I had read everything Steve Sodders had written, and I was like, oh, this is great, and I saw all these stats coming out of Velocity Conference. And I'm like, we need to do something about this. So I put together this like 20-page PDF, and I just shoved it full of data. And I walked into my boss's office, kind of cockily, and I set it down on the table. I'm like, you need to look at this. We need to be doing something here. And I kind of walked away. Maybe that was slightly over-dramatized, but it was similar. It was how I felt inside, right? I was sure he was going to look at this thing and be like, this is great. You're right. We're missing out on so much here. Have a raise, like the car and everything. I don't think he made it past the first couple paragraphs before his eyes glazed over. It was too much data, too much stats, way overwhelming, kind of boring. It was all the stuff I thought was interesting, but it didn't appeal to him. What I should have done is I should have made it visual. Instead of trying to convey this through a whole bunch of text and data, we need to make these sorts of cases visually so that it's easy to see at a glance that there are performance differences that we can tackle. If nobody listens to anything else out of this presentation, you have to check out webpagetest.org. It is a ridiculously phenomenal resource that Google provides for free for public and private use, and it has a wealth of tools in there. Fantastic. But there are two things in there that I use for the visual comparison. One is you can record a video of a page as it's loading. So in this case, you have Sports Illustrated and ESPN's mobile sites next to each other. And what this does is at a glance you can see already as ESPN was loading and finishing up that Sports Illustrated is still going on, still trying to figure out what it's going to put on the page, and there's this huge performance difference. And I don't have to convey that through text, and I don't have to try and put some sort of charts there. I just let them watch the videos and they can see for themselves. It's pretty self-evident. I really like this. They actually have a tool specifically for this, which is the screenshot comparison, where it'll take screenshots at periods throughout the page load time. And again, this is ESPN and Sports Illustrated, and you can see that by 2.5 seconds there, that third block, ESPN's pretty much done. I've got navigation, I've got stories, I've got photos, I can start looking at what I'm going to do. Sports Illustrated still hasn't even given me a header. When you present it this way, there's some numbers on the page, but they don't matter. When you present it this way, the visuals do all the talking for you and all the convincing for you. And you also make it competitive, right? I mean, if you show this to ESPN, they're going to do something about it. They don't want to lose to Sports Illustrated when it comes to something like that. When you demonstrate it visually, the next thing you have to do is you have to make it matter. And that was a big mistake that I made with that big PDF document, right? It didn't matter. I thought all of these statistics that I thought were so important would do all the convincing for me, but the reality is we all have different jobs. We all have different criteria by which we're deemed either successful or not successful, and you need to find a way to make the plea on that level. Now, this is where a sprinkling of data can help, just a little bit, and there's a ton of case studies to pull from. Amazon found out that for every 100 milliseconds that they shaved off load time, they got a 1% increase in revenue. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, maybe, but if you look at second quarter of this year, they pulled in $19.3 billion in revenue, which means that for every 100 millisecond they saved off load time, that's an additional $193 million in a single quarter. Unsurprisingly, they take performance very seriously. They have a dedicated team for this, and the dedicated team has come out and said, you know what? Our goal is to not exist. We want performance so integrated into everybody in this project, everybody in the process, that we don't have to be there. That's 193 million really good reasons for that. In a more general study, the Aberdeen Consulting Group wanted to see what happens when you make a page 1 second slower. 1 second, again, doesn't sound like a lot. But what they saw was an 11% decrease in page views, a 16% decrease in customer satisfaction, a 7% decrease in conversions. If their site is making $100,000 a day, this turns into $2.5 million in lost revenue over the course of a year. Now, looking at this kind of an impact from this way and seeing how it impacts how people are interacting with your site, it's pretty easy to see how this is really bad for business and how, in fact, you can actually make the case that it can destroy a company entirely. This is Tumblr. Does anybody remember Posterous? Right? Okay. So they were both microblogging services, and Tumblr came out. They had a little bit of a head start. But Posterous came out, and they tried to do a lot of the same things, making this blogging stuff very simple. You could even email a post into your account. It was very nice. And at first, it was pretty competitive, and people were writing all sort of tech articles like, should you do Posterous or should you do Tumblr? And it was pretty heated. And you can see that they had similar trajectories early on after Posterous kicked in. But over here, all of a sudden, Tumblr starts to leave Posterous in the dust. They're just blowing them away in terms of growth. Now, there's a couple reasons why this could be the case. One certainly could be that Tumblr had that head start and they were first to market. That's something we can't ignore. But if you dig deeper, there's some stats that are kind of compelling. One company took a look at how long the time to display. So you hit a URL in the browser to when it shows up on the screen. You can just see it. You can't interact with it yet. Tumblr was just under 3 seconds. Posterous was twice as slow, around 6 seconds for time to display. Then they looked at time to interact. Okay, how long does it take between when you enter a URL to when you can actually interact with the page and do something? Tumblr, about 3,500 milliseconds. Posterous, again, twice as slow. Now, given what we've seen about how even something as small as 100 millisecond or a second can dramatically alter how a site or application gets used, it's not hard to see how something like this puts you at a significant disadvantage against somebody you're up for market share. In fact, VC investor, one of the most prominent VC investors out there, Fred Wilson, has come right out and said, you know what, speed's the most important feature. If your app is slow, people aren't going to use it. If something's slow, they're just gone. And he's gone on to say that, you know what, he's seen it firsthand, that when the apps and the sites that he invests in, when they start to slow down, user behavior is altered dramatically and engagement just drops, which makes him think that speed isn't just a feature, it's a requirement that's frequently undervalued and overlooked. Now, making the case this way starts to really hammer home that bad performance is bad business. And this is an important place to get that management tier to come to, because once you get here, then you can start to get concrete about things. On that project that I worked on, when we were saying everything was going to be fast, we had nothing concrete to stand on because fast is a relative term. It means one thing to me and it means something else to everybody else in this room. Getting concrete, defining something specific and going from there gives us something to push back on. And this is what Vitaly talked about with the performance budget. In case anybody missed his session, a performance budget is what it sounds like. You decide that this page is going to load in, say, less than 3 seconds on a DSL network or something like that. And you ensure that the page does exactly that that's the target you're going to hit. You can convert that down to page weight or requests or something like that and make sure that the page doesn't exceed those metrics. Now, how you come to those metrics, that varies based on your site. How fast is fast enough? That's a question that's always asked. We have a couple general rules that we can look at from there. There are some interface response times that have been pretty clearly defined since the 1960s and then popularized again by Jacob Nielsen in the 1990s, I believe, which says that if a software system reacts within 100 milliseconds, it feels instantaneous to the user. If they react within 1,000, 1 second, then that user still remains in an uninterrupted state of flow. Like they can feel the difference. They know that it's not instantly reacting, but they're still uninterrupted and focused on the task at hand. Anything beyond that, and you start to lose them a little bit. Now, these are aggressive targets, right? Trying to get this, hit 100 milliseconds or 1,000. Those are tough things to do, especially on slow networks, but they're reachable, and we've talked a lot about the techniques through Vitaly's session, and there's several books and great talks on this I'm happy to discuss with you guys after. So it's possible, But especially if you're somebody who's just kind of getting into this in an organization, it's not easy. So what you can do to find a little bit more conservative is actually start to analyze the performance of your site as it stands today. Pick a couple key templates. So if you're a newspaper site, maybe that's an article page, maybe that's a blog, and maybe that's a home page. If you're a recipe site, then that would be a recipe, a home page, things like that, user profile maybe. Find out how they perform, throw them in web page test, and see what they're doing today. Then do the same thing with some competitors. Grab 10 to 12 competitors that are doing the same sorts of things, or sites that are doing the same sorts of things. Find their similar templates, shove them in web page test, and see what's happening. And then you can apply a little bit of science. The 20% rule was something that was introduced in a book, Understanding and Engineering Time, The Psychology of Time Perception. And what this says is that people notice difference in time durations when that duration starts to exceed 20%. So if you want something to be perceived as faster, it needs to be 20% faster, or else most people probably aren't going to notice. So what this means is that if you're loading in 10 seconds right now, you need to be loading in about 8 seconds for it to be a noticeable difference. If you're loading in 9, most people won't realize that it's any faster. If a competitor is loading in 5 seconds and you want to be perceived as faster, you need to load in about 4 seconds. So this is what we did with a recent project for Radio Free Europe. We took the key templates for their pages. We decided the homepage and article was primarily what we were concerned with. And we did that with some of their competitors, or I guess they don't really have competitors, so it's more like similar sites in this case, like The Guardian and CNN and things that are doing similar things with news. And we ran the test through web page test, and we recorded some of the key metrics. That's the stuff right here. Off to the side there, those are the targets. So that's where we applied our 20% rule, and we started to see, okay, well, where does this actually put us if we want to be faster than this site? Now, from this, we were able to arrive at a number, a conservative number, for us to use as a performance budget. Now, ultimately, we ended up going a little bit more aggressive, just because it turns out that a lot of these sites are pretty slow tested on these mobile networks. But it doesn't have to be fancy. It was just a simple spreadsheet that we plugged all this data into so that we could quickly calculate what we needed to do. And then we used that budget and we enforced it throughout the project. So this is Pattern Lab, which, based on the atomic design stuff, again, that Vitaly talked about. I wrote just a simple little JavaScript snippet that would append the load time up into the top corner there. And it compares it versus the budget that we've set. So if we're above budget, as we are in this page, which is okay because it shows everything in the entire site on here. But if we're not making our budget, it turns red. So we see all the time as we're developing and working on our site immediately that we're not doing things right performance-wise. If we are, it turns green. That's that initial and immediate feedback every single time we load a page, every single time we make a style change. It's unavoidable. Then that wasn't quite enough, so for the build process, we're using Grunt. So for Grunt, what I did, I wrote a simple little task built on the web page test API that would let us run a test through web page test and compare the results with our defined budget. So every time we do a deploy, we run this test to see where we are. And it's also a standalone test, so we can do it individually whenever we want throughout the project. But what this does is it lets us do things like this and say, hey, we want to see how we're doing against our budget. We send it out to web page test, and if it comes back and it fails, the entire build process fails. We can't deploy unless this passes or we manually override it. It's pretty strict, but in this case, performance was so important that we couldn't risk it, and so that's why we have it here. So we have that feedback throughout the development process, as well as a hard-coded stop in our development process that ensures that we're going to hit these targets. It sounds kind of aggressive, but when you do this, your users are going to thank you, because when you do this, when you set a budget and you stick to it, you're placing priority on one of the most fundamental components of the user experience online. In fact, Luke Wroblewski, he's come out and said that, being a web designer, not considering performance, it's like being a print designer, not considering how your colors are going to print. It's kind of basic and fundamental and essential. It has to happen. And I don't think this is really a surprise when we think about it, because the web is an interactive, dynamic medium. We scroll up and down a page, we submit a form, we click a link. These are all interactions, and they're the core of what it means to experience a website. If those interactions are slow, it fundamentally alters how we are interacting with that site or application. I think it was Brad Frost who first said it, but performance is about respect. It's about respecting the people who come to your site. It's about respecting their time. People are busy. They have no shortage of options online to find other content. If you waste their time, they're going to go elsewhere. And if you think that people don't notice, just do a little Twitter search for slow site one time and see what happens. This is like a 2-day span, I think, of tweets where I just pulled out some of them. This isn't even all of them. These are people that are complaining about sites being slow, not understanding why they're so slow, doing a lot of misspelling as well. But they're very upset by the fact that these sites aren't respecting their time. They aren't valuing their time. You know, your site's continually slow as molasses. It's hard to keep giving you money for this. Your site is painfully slow and it's wasting a huge amount of my time. And if you waste people's time, they're just not going to come back. 60% of people say that if a site loads too slowly, they're less likely to return to that site. 40% of those people say they're going to go hop off to a competitor's site instead now. For the few people who do come back, the people who are willing to slog through the experience again, you've left a bad taste in their mouth, and those bad experiences, those bad tastes linger. Google did a study where they added a couple hundred milliseconds to their page load time. They wanted to see what happened to user engagement. Kind of boringly, like we all kind of could predict by now, user engagement dropped, right? People performed less searches. They were just generally less engaged with the site. That's boring. What was interesting was when they removed the delay. Those people who had initially experienced the delay continued to be less engaged throughout, long after the delay had already been fixed. It took a long time for their behavior to return to normal. They had removed the problem, but the bad experience lingered enough to still alter behavior. Performance is about respecting people's money. Now, I understand in Europe you guys are getting rid of roaming, right? Right? Is this a thing? Maybe? No? I thought I heard this somewhere. All right, well, never mind. And this is relevant to you. I thought this was going to be a plea as an American. This is the Oakley site. When it was first launched, it was like 85 megabytes. I think by now, if you guys have been to more than one conference, you've probably seen this example. But I keep using it because it was so good. Andy Clark, a designer, kind of did the math, and he's like, you know what, that's like $785 to look at this on my iPhone. Kind of expensive. Now, they did a lot of hard work. I think it's down to 13 megs now, which makes it practically a steal at about $200 or something like that. I don't remember what it works out to. But that's kind of ridiculous, right? Now, not everything is this obviously bad. Ronan Kremen from MobiForge did a post where he was trying to look at, you know, how much would more typical, slightly heavy sites cost in these roaming situations. Things like the Next Web would cost $44 a single page. Things like Vogue cost $65 every single page you load up. Is this really worth it, right? For one page of content when I can undoubtedly find it somewhere else online? Put it another way, I can spend $65 and visit one page of vogue.co.uk, or I can go down to the grocery store and buy 15 copies of the magazine. Most importantly, performance is about respecting people's desire for content in the first place. When Ethan Marcotte wrote the article that introduced the world to responsive design, he said, now more than ever, we're designing work meant to be viewed along a gradient of different experiences. And I've always loved that gradient of different experiences phrase because I think it perfectly captures what it is that the web can do, what the web can provide. And I think we're getting better as a whole of acknowledging that, right? Our, responsive design is really taking off, and we're starting to adjust our workflows in ways that kind of respond to this a little bit better. But the fact that sites continue to get fatter and fatter tells me we're ignoring a few of these gradients. We're ignoring the fact that people can access these sites on a variety of networks with gradients of bandwidth and latency constraints, on a variety of devices with gradients of power and CPU capability and memory. And you tell this to people, and some people get really irritated. These are the people who are like, they want to be using, everything that they possibly can right now, all the new hotness, like the web components immediately, all of these things right away. And they get really ticked off when you tell them that there are all these old, devices and networks that you have to deal with. But you know what? It's just about embracing constraints. This isn't a bad thing. Embracing constraints causes you to focus. It causes you to innovate. It's a great thing. Has anybody heard of this book? Green Eggs and Ham, right? Yeah? So this is probably one of the best loved children books of all time, at least from a US market. I'm not exactly sure how it is, but I imagine it's got some global appeal. Dr. Seuss wrote this in 50 words. 50 words. It was a bet from a friend who said, you know what, I don't think you could write a book in 50 words or less, so Dr. Seuss did. And yet it turned into one of the most beloved children's classics of all time. That's constraints. That's playing within constraints. This is something YouTube learned very recently. This is YouTube watch page. It's what you go when you go to watch something on YouTube. And it gets kind of heavy, 1.2, 1.3 megabytes, somewhere in there. And a couple engineers there were getting kind of fed up. They're like, we used to play video games that weighed less than this. This seems silly. This seems ridiculous. So they decided to try and fix it. Now what they came up with was YouTube Feather. Now they removed a lot of the cruft, the things people don't really care about, and kept just the core content. And when the HTML5 video player is in place, it's about 100K. From 1.2 megabytes to about 100K, a dramatic difference. Now they're feeling pretty good about this, right? So they open this up, let people opt in, put this out in a few different countries, things like that. And a few weeks later, they decide they're going to come back and watch the stats and see what happened. Now they're expecting everything to go through the roof based on what we've seen, right? Metrics are going to go, yay, users are going to be so happy. It's not what happened. It actually turned out that it took significantly longer for videos to load on average on this page than it did on the page that was over 10 times the same weight. This blew their minds. This is the exact opposite of what you would have expected to see, right? So they looked deeper. And what they found out was that for YouTube Feather, word had gotten out in certain areas where there was really poor connectivity. So places in Siberia, some of the Middle East, these different countries that really struggle with connectivity. And all of a sudden, people were accessing YouTube, sometimes for the first time ever, because it was finally light enough for them to be able to do it. I mean, think about that for a second. Think about how much time we waste on YouTube, how many Rickrolls and how many cat videos. You actually could question whether this was a public service or if the productivity in these countries immediately dropped. But it caused YouTube to come to the conclusion that, you know what, by keeping your client code small, by optimizing for performance, by prioritizing it, you literally open your product up to new markets. That can be kind of a painful lesson to learn, right? It's something you don't want to hear, that you're excluding a whole large audience, a whole segment of users, and your boss certainly doesn't want to. But it's an important one. Because the power of the web is its ubiquity. The web can go anywhere, any connected device, any kind of connection. It can reach them on anything. That's amazing, right? That's what blows my mind. That's what gets me fired up about working on the web. But when we start to do things like deprioritize performance, we start to limit the very power that makes the web such an amazing and incredible medium. We start to take away the ability for it to do what it inherently does. And you run into situations like this. We may not even know that we're doing it. This is the Disney responsive site shortly after it was launched. And I fired it up on an iPhone over a 3G connection, so not the worst thing in the world. But it takes about 30 seconds. 30 seconds before anything loads up on this page. Now, Disney got a lot of high praise for this, and rightfully so. They were a big company tackling responsive fairly early on. There's some smart things going on. But that's the experience people got on a 3G network, right? That's painful. If that is what the people working on the project had to experience, if that's what the developers and the designers and the managers had to deal with while they were building this, there's no way that would have ever shipped, because nobody's going to sit through that. Bad performance has to hurt. We have to feel it. We need to feel the pain before we inflict that pain on our users. We need to channel our inner performance masochists, right? Embrace the pain. And there's a whole lot of tools you can use. You can throttle your network in a million different ways to be able to experience what it's like to load your application or site on a slow connection. And it doesn't matter so much what tool you use. It just matters that we do it. You have to be able to pour salt in our performance wounds. There's a lot of value in that. Which means that we can't live inside of Photoshop the entire time, right? A flat comp is fantastic for many reasons. I actually don't hate Photoshop. I think it has an absolute place in our workflow. But it doesn't tell you anything about the performance of the site itself, right? You need to get out into the browser, and that's why things like Pattern Lab or the Living Style Guide kind of approaches where you're working in the browser actually make a lot of sense, because you can test individual components as you're going. There's a lot of value in, as Dan Rubin was talking about, destroying the walls between designers and developers, and letting them work more collaboratively and iteratively together. And speaking of outdoorsmen, right? The stubble, the snow, the flannel, that's all that's needed. That's all that's needed. Thanks. You're welcome. You're welcome. There's a lot of value in getting designers and developers working closely together. There's more than just that. It's a lot of what people think about performance is actually perception. Perception is actually reality. A lot of performance can be designed. This is the Houston International Airport had a huge problem. They had a ton of complaints about how long it took people to get their bags at their airport. It was a very difficult thing. Requests coming in all the time, people complaining always. And they were like, okay, well, the simple solution, let's hire some more baggage handlers. So they did. They they hired a bunch more people, and the wait time plummeted to 8 minutes. But the complaints persisted. People still weren't happy. So like, all right, well, this doesn't make any sense. So they dug a little deeper, and what they found out was that it took 1 minute to get to the baggage claim area, where you stood then for 7 minutes, and then you received your bag, and everybody was happy at the end. Now, I would have loved to have been in this meeting, because I don't know what sick person gets this into their head and decides that this is a potential solution, but somebody's like, you know what we should do? Let's not reduce the wait time anymore. Let's not hire any more people. Instead, let's make them walk 7 times as far to get their bag. And somebody else in the room is like, you know what, that's a great idea. That'll teach those. Now, this sounds like a surefire way to piss people off to me, but it worked. The complaints went away completely. People were working harder to get their bags and waiting just as long, but nobody complained because they were occupied, because they weren't standing still bored the entire time. We can apply some of this to what we do. This is Polar, which is a mobile application built by Wroblewski. And it's used on mobile networks. They want it to be fast. It's all about micro interaction, so it kind of has to be fast. But they can't make networks magically, reduce latency and increase bandwidth. So they fake things. So when you go to submit a poll, you instantly see your poll right there on the screen. Boom, it's there, instantaneous as soon as you hit submit. You can vote on it. You can share the link it's got. You can everything that you could do with a poll, what you would expect to be able to do, you're able to do. The reality is that's just a temporary version. That's not the real thing. The real thing is still being synced up into the cloud, right? Well, the cloud. The servers, I kind of hate the cloud term. I don't know why I used that. But it's being synced up in the background, completely oblivious to you. You think the real thing's already there. And in fact, this takes a little bit more work on the side of Polar because they have to sync the data then in case anything gets interacted with locally on the device. But from a user perspective, it completely obscures any performance issues because you think right away there's your stuff. iOS does a lot of this. This is what happens when you go to open a page in a new tab. Now watch kind of closely as the animation is happening. What's happening is as soon as you tap that, it's starting to load the page. Now the animation is keeping you distracted while the page is actually coming in full. So it gets itself, maybe a couple hundred milliseconds, but it's a head start. So when it pops back up, it starts to feel a lot faster because it's gotten that little bit of a head start. They also have the ability on iOS, you can do the preloading, like the top hits, the top URLs thing. So if you go to ESPN.com, it's a recognized top URL for iOS. What it'll do is it'll actually start loading as you're typing into the URL browser. So again, as soon as you hit enter, the page just basically instantly appears. And it's because it's been working in the background this entire time without you noticing it. These aren't technical solutions. Now, technically, there's things involved that people had to code, right? But this is performance by design. This is what happens when you get everybody on a team, designers, developers, everybody thinking about performance. We never got lost looking for a Christmas tree again. We decided, yeah, it's fun to do once, but, not again. So we started to take steps. We built steps into the process to make sure it didn't happen. We tied strings around trees. We brought a compass. We checked our bearings. We did all the things that, smart people should probably do. The web is getting fat. But it doesn't have to, right? We can do the same thing. We can fix this. We have the ability to make awesome experiences. We can bake performance into the process. We can make sure that it doesn't get left to chance. We can channel our inner performance masochists and make sure that we're embracing the pain and feeling what it feels like on slow networks before we put that on our users. And we can get everyone on the team involved in thinking about performance from the onset so that we avoid those problems before they become too big for us to solve. We could create things that are awesome. We can create things that are going to blow people's mind, make people really enjoy using our applications and our sites. And finally, we can build a site in an application and create a web that really is for everyone, no matter what their device, no matter what their network. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. A couple of questions. We still have time.
Thanks for the presentation. It was really awesome. Also in the talk before, we saw a lot of time the term from web page test with the speed index. So maybe you can explain the speed index too.
Sure. Yeah. So speed index, which I didn't talk about. Speed index. You know, remember the screenshot page where it was showing the screenshot, and you could see how the page was filling in over time. Speed index is a measure of that. It's a measure of how quickly the majority of the content is being displayed on the page, how quickly that becomes visible. So the lower the number, the lower the speed index number, the better. What they like about it is metrics like load time, for example, can be easily faked. You can just decide we're just going to load everything after page load, and woo, our load time's amazing, but there's nothing on the page, right? Metrics like that have inherent flaws, and so speed index is supposed to be a slightly a more accurate representation of how a page is loading. You can currently only test it through web page test, which is a limitation, and it's also a little tougher to explain. You know, if you're talking to somebody who's not technical, and you know, it's easy to say right away what visually complete or page load is versus what speed index is. But there's still a lot of value in the metric. I actually use that quite a bit for our budgets. Yeah, I just didn't get into that metric specifically, but it is worthwhile looking into. Web page test has documented it pretty heavily. You know, I can find, if you come up afterwards, I'll get you a link for Patrick Meenan, who maintains Web Page Test, actually has a nice post explaining it.
Hi.
Hi.
You didn't mention ecological aspects, but like a fat web would be like an SUV that consumes more like energy. There is more cooling needed to send the data across. The device has to get hotter to show the site, etc. Is that a factor, or is it just irrelevant in quantity?
I don't know. I've never looked into that in depth. I know that I had a talk with Steve Sodders, who I mentioned him earlier, where we were talking about those sorts of things. I think that there are a couple companies that have case studies on that. I'm not sure I know of them off the top of my head, though. That would be super interesting. Well, I know there are companies that have measured like power consumption and things like that. Again, if you come up afterwards and give me, like, I don't have the links obviously right now, but if you give me your email address, I'll send you some as soon as I find. I'll do a little digging. But yeah, it's a good. I like the SUV analogy too. I may actually steal that with credit. Any other questions, or are we good?
I think we are about to finish. Thank you very much, team.